Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's event, one of a clutch of events that are reviewing the first 12 months of the Labour government. We're going to focus on policy rather than on politics. So try to think about and focus on some of the policy areas that we think the government, when they came into power, were quite ambitious about what they wanted to see happen, and then sort of ask questions about how much progress has been made in those policy areas and what we think some of the reasons why that progress has happened or why it hasn't happened in quite the way that it was anticipated, to see if we can identify a few of the sort of cross-cutting issues. And I've got three great panelists to explore these policy areas. So we've got Naomi, Clayton, who's Chief Executive of the Institute for Employment Studies, and Naomi's going to focus on the policy areas around employment, labour markets, economic inactivity, where the government's been ambitious in that space. We've got Heather Sargent, who's a barrister at Landmark Chambers, and he's going to focus on planning reform, housing delivery, new towns, etc. Again, an area where the government came in with quite ambitious plans and has had quite a busy policy programme in relation to that. And then thirdly is Paul Swinney, Director of Policy and Research at the Centre for Cities. And Paul's going to focus on growth, productivity and the industrial strategy. And so there's a kind of question there about also sort of ambitions in that programme. So the way we're going to try and do it is we're going to get very short, big picture, quick reflections from Naomi, Heather and Paul on their policy areas. Then we'll dive into a bit more detail on each of them in turn, and then we'll try to identify some of those cross-cutting issues or themes that we think are explaining to the extent that progress has been made or frustrations have been generated. So without further ado, Naomi, you're going to kick us off and give us a sort of big picture, very quick fire reflections on the government's progress on employment and employment related matters. So Naomi, welcome, and over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. And for those of you who don't know Institute for Employment Studies, we are an independent centre for applied research and insight on issues relating to employment, skills and the labour market. So I'm going to focus on some of the reforms that we've seen brought in relation to the kind of labour market and the challenges, trying to address some of the challenges around economic inactivity. So I think generally at a high level, I think the government over the last year has made progress in setting out a series of reforms that kind of really recognise the labour market challenges that we're facing as a country, and the problems and issues that we've got with the employment and skills system kind of more broadly. So, you know, when kind of Labour returned to government last year, had a record number of people, 2.8 million people who were out of work due to long-term ill health. We had persistent employment rate gaps, so disabled people 2.5 times more likely to be out of work compared to those who were not disabled. And as I think we're probably all aware here, some really significant spatial inequalities too. So I think we've seen over the course of the last year a series of reforms being introduced that try to address those challenges and also recognise some of the challenges that we've got in the system. One being that we've got highly centralised employment support system. It remains really quite fragmented at the local level. And also we've got relatively low levels of trust in the system. And when we talk to people about their experiences of kind of Job Centre Plus and the support they received to kind of prepare for and find work through our Commission on the Future of Employment Support, people were generally quite negative about the support that they received. So a number of challenges, and I think you know, Labour has set, an ambitious objective, long-term objective for an 80% employment rate. I think arguments around kind of whether that employment rate is achievable kind of misses the point, because the point is to set a really ambitious objective that drives improvement across all parts of the system. And we've obviously seen, a set of quite welcome reforms being introduced through the Get Britain Working White Paper that reflected a lot of the recommendations that we'd set out in our Commission on the Future of Employment Support, the new National Jobs and Careers Service, the introduction of Get Britain Working local plans, and a focus on trying to really integrate the work, health and skills system alongside the youth guarantee. I think the challenges with all of this is there isn't a lot of money in the system, as we all know. We've had, we've had several months of a lengthy debate around the new welfare bill, which is designed to make kind of cost savings in terms of the health-related welfare bill. And huge amount of debate there, designed to make cost savings. And I think in general, government are reliant on kind of taking a very targeted approach with kind of limited public money, and reliant on having to make cost savings and making efficiencies in the system. And a lot of the reforms that have been introduced in the last year are going to take time to implement. So it's kind of high level view on where I think we've got to,
Brilliant.
but I think it's the right level of ambition.
Yeah, thank you, Naomi. That's really, I mean, already introducing, we're going to hear, I'm sure, from Heather in a second, that, ambitious targets, questions about money, recognizing difficult problems, but also problems in the system itself, as well as the challenge of the problem per se, and then questions about time and how long these kind of things take. It's a very good sort of insight about where the government, or any government at 12 months ago, would have been. Heather, give us the big picture overview on the planning space.
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, yeah, hats off actually to MHCLG. Being realistic, they've been really busy. I mean, the manifesto headline was that they were going to reform our planning rules to build the railways, roads, labs, and the 1.5 million homes that we need, and to develop a new 10-year infrastructure strategy. And I think they've done a good job of getting the ball rolling on most of their manifesto commitments. So much has happened that realistically, I haven't got any hope of covering all of it this morning. But I think, as you'd expect, the critical question ultimately is, they've set off on these various journeys. Will those journeys take them to the intended destination? So the delivery of the 1.5 million homes. There's, I think it's fair to say, a degree of scepticism already as to whether that target's too ambitious. But in a nutshell, some big moves have been completed. So we had the revised NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework, in December. We've had the new standard method for calculating housing need, although obviously that's not the last time the NPPF will be revised. The government's already said it's looking to revise it again down the line. We've got, in terms of sort of large moves that are still awaiting completion, there's notably the Planning and Infrastructure Bill that's in the House of Lords now, working its way through Parliament. And there's quite a lot of important measures in that. So particularly measures to speed up the NSIP regime for infrastructure and to increase certainty around delivery of that, and also the introduction of strategic sub-regional planning through spatial development strategies. So I think they've got off to a sort of speedy and ambitious start, and yeah, they are doing a good job of carrying forward most of what they said they would do in the manifesto. But as we'll come back to later on, there's never enough finance in the system for anything, it seems. And there are obstacles posed by things that are just well beyond the reach of planning reform. So in terms of the housing position and the delivery of those new homes, commentators have mentioned there's not enough support for first-time buyers. There's a skills shortage. That's probably something that Naomi's well placed to talk about as well. So I think from a planning reform perspective, it's all moving in the right direction, but there are sort of other forces that the government will need to respond to going forward.
Brilliant, thanks, Heather. And again, a sort of interesting around, they came in with a sort of clear-eyed view of what the problem was. We didn't build much, we don't build enough, and it takes a long time and costs more, etc. It's kind of interesting, as you say, to think about the reforms that have been proposed and are being introduced as to whether they deal with that big picture sort of analysis of the problem, which we'll come back to as well. Paul, give us the big overview on industrial strategy, productivity, growth.
Thanks, Andrew. So I think there were probably three phases to the government's approach to these agendas. The first one is they made announcements when they first came in and said growth is our #1 mission, which was excellent, because I don't think economic growth probably had been the #1 mission of previous governments, and we have drifted. We've seen productivity flatline for the last 15 or 16 years. That impacts on wages, that impacts on people's standards of living. So that was then put there. The first thing on the table, I think, was really, really important, and hopefully was about to set the direction. Then we went into a bit of a phony war, really, around growth, because then the government didn't really talk about anything, or didn't sort of put any policies in place that would actually try to start to get that growth going, notwithstanding all the changes around planning, which ultimately are a really important part as well. But anything with that very specific element feeding into growth, there was just very little said, very little done, which was a bit strange. And that second period, that sort of phony war, lasted for a long time. In fact, it probably lasted until about the start of last month, where all of a sudden there've been an absolute flurry of announcements, starting with the spending review, where the government said it was going to spend £113 billion on capital and project investments. Good, starting to get money into the system to try and bring about change. Then followed up with the industrial strategy in particular, which has been a year in the making. We had a green paper in October. We finally got the white paper a couple of weeks ago, which set out what it is it wants to do and try to shape the direction of policy and attach money to particular policy directions, which again is a good thing in terms of trying to create some certainty. And then there have been a number of other things that have come out already, like the national infrastructure strategy. We're also expecting a national integrated transport strategy, and there are other strategies that are floating around as well. So finally, some action. From a policy announcement perspective, of course, the big challenge now is that a policy announcement is not the same as actually putting that policy in place. And the challenge for the government will be that now, 4 years out from the next election, it's going to have to get going in terms of doing these things if it wants to be able to show on the doorstep in 4 years' time that it is starting to achieve things, and that it is has been able to create an improvement in the performance of the UK economy.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Paul. And again, a big sort of growth target about, fastest growth in the G7, etc. And then the question always is whether what's then been done it is pointed in that direction or not. Should have said at the beginning, if you've got comments or questions, your own thoughts on what's happening, what's been happening over the last 12 months, use the Q&A function, and I'll insert them into the conversation as appropriate. Right, Naomi, let's come back to you. So you give us a bit of a picture, and interestingly, sort of the big ambition, not the only ambition, 80% employment rate target, you questioned that as a laudable, it's a laudable, but whether it's realizable, but nevertheless gives an anchor. When you then sort of review what's been going on and think about, whether the progress that's been made in sort of getting towards that, give us some of the headlines. Obviously, there's too much detail to go into the minutiae of everything that's been going on in your space, because it's been a lot, as you said. But just to sort of, again, some of the notable successes, maybe some of the notable failures or not so successes. How would you say that? How would you describe that, Naomi?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Paul and Heather have set out, it feels like we've seen a lot of kind of new policy and strategies announced over the last 12 months, and what's really critical now is that we implement those things effectively. So I think government have made good progress on those kind of supply side reforms. And I think we need to maintain that focus on kind of long-term systems change, innovation within the system, and really focusing on kind of outcomes-based accountability. Because I think one of the challenges we've had in these policy areas in the past is just the amount of churn and kind of short-term funding, which makes it really difficult to do kind of proper systems change. So it's really good to see the kind of the focus on that, and putting kind of mayoral combined authorities and local partners in the kind of driving seat there, in terms of, you know, them taking a lead on the Get Britain Working plans, which are very much focused, obviously, as I've said, on kind of you know, integrating the work, health and skills system at the local level. And you've also seen local groups of local authorities being put in the lead on the new Connect to Work programme to support people with health conditions and disabled people into work, and seeing them in the, you know, taking the lead on the design of that offer is a good thing. So I think we've made progress there. I think the challenge with all of this is there isn't a great deal of money, and it's not clear that we've recognised just how much investment and resource it will take to achieve the kinds of systems change that we need. It's not about necessarily introducing new kind of programs and interventions. It's about how we can join up the system, but that will in itself take kind of time and resource. So I think we need to recognise that. I think, you know, with the spending review, we saw confirmation that of the additional support, employment support for people with health conditions. Again, that's very welcome, because absolutely we need to be extending employment support. And we've seen the rollout of youth hubs, another good initiative, a focus on kind of what works and what's effective, which is good. But coming back to what I said around kind of government needing to take a targeted approach, you've clearly seen that with the youth guarantee. That's focused at the moment on 18 to 21-year-olds who are claiming universal credit. And there is quite a clear argument for scaling that activity up. Obviously, we've got the youth trailblazers that being kind of piloted across the country. I think, you know, there is clear arguments for scaling that type of activity up to really support more young people. You know, over 1 million young people who are not in education, employment or training, and some real challenges there, I think. So there's an issue on kind of, you know, how we effectively implement these reforms, how we scale up activity, particularly in terms of youth support. And then I think there's the role of employers too, because I think, you know, I think it's generally recognised that employers play a critical role in addressing some of the labour market challenges that we've got, and addressing kind of levels of economic inactivity, whether that's, you know, on kind of their approach to recruitment, kind of job design, kind of job carving. But that feels like a bit of a gap at the moment. Obviously, we've got the Mayfield review at the moment, which is very much focused on the role of employers in supporting retention. But generally, as a country, you know, we haven't been brilliant at engaging employers in employment support programmes. Quite often struggle to kind of engage employers in kind of locally led initiatives too. And of course, that fragmented system that we see at the local level has a big impact on employers. It's quite often really difficult for both individuals and employers to navigate the employment and skills system. So I would say, some very welcome steps, but it really does feel like early days in terms of the implementation of those reforms. And there are some gaps. I would say.
Just before I come to Heather, get her sort of more considered view or more detailed view, it's a tough question, Naomi. When you're thinking about the sort of areas that you're talking about, do you have a sense as to how the government's thinking about, is this just a money problem? If we put more money into this area, we can do more. That's an obvious thing. Or where is their heads on, actually this is quite a reform agenda. It's not, we have to do things in a quite fundamentally different way. And you have some of these sort of tensions going on, right? Which is, in some respects, some say it's all through reform, and the money can remain constant because we'll just do it better, do it more efficiently. Others say no, it's just a money issue. If you don't put money into the system, it doesn't matter what you. Just very briefly, it's a big question, but how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's recognition that there needs to be both. Obviously there are very clear fiscal constraints, and the government are very focused on public sector reform, and as I've said, that systems change, and I think that reflects the need for systems change and public service reform, but at the same time responding to some of the challenges that we've got as a country, namely record numbers of people out of work, long-term sick, how you extend employment support to those people. That requires investment, and I think that's why we've seen that additional investment come in there. But I think generally there is a very heavy focus on public service reform.
Yeah, interesting. Heather, give us. I mean, again, it's a super busy policy space, as you say. You can't possibly cover everything. But what would be the highlights? And I suppose, again, if you think back to the critique of the system, or the problem, which is we don't build enough, it takes too long and it costs too much. Your reflections on progress and issues arising in regards to that.
Yeah, so I think just picking up on the kind of quite famous by now 1.5 million homes target. I mean, that remains the target, including in last month's spending review. But actually, the BBC reports that the number of new homes fell in the second half of 2024. There's analysis, I think it was by West One Loans, that suggests that in the 3 quarters since Labour took office, there were 86,000 housing starts, which is up from the final 3 quarters under the Conservatives, but it's not the number that we need on a sort of purely mathematical analysis to get to the 1.5. And the Home Builders Federation, I think this is data from Glenigan, is reporting that in the first quarter of this year, actually, the number of residential units that were granted planning permission was the lowest for over 20 years. So whilst you would expect this to be, an ambition that perhaps comes to full fruition later in Parliament, and you wouldn't expect necessarily in year one that you'd get your 300 or your 370,000 homes delivered, and you can say, well, they're laying the groundwork. Nevertheless, it's perhaps not the most reassuring start in terms of actually delivery of the units, seems to me. And I think they also, in the manifesto, said they wanted to make full use of the intervention powers to build the houses that they need. I haven't seen much evidence of that yet. I know that consultation closed on Tuesday on a reform working paper called Speeding Up and Building Out. And there's lots of ideas in that, including a potential new delayed homes penalty if developers fall materially behind pre-agreed build-out schedules. Yeah. So maybe that will be something a bit kind of punchier from the government. I know they encouraged Homes England last autumn to be more interventionist, including through using CPO powers. I'm not aware that Homes England has done that yet. I'm happy to be corrected. They hadn't last time I checked. But again, I mean, there's also discussion still around reforming the CPO system, taking out hope value from assessment of compensation, which is a work in progress. I don't know what the kind of final outcome of that is yet. And on the practical side of things, there are still difficulties from both water neutrality and nutrient neutrality, so practical difficulties. That's one thing that the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is seeking to address. But as I said, that hasn't made it onto the statute book yet. So we'll have to wait and see what happens there. I think more positively in the spending review in terms of making housing more affordable, which also was one of the manifesto commitments, there's been £39 billion announced for a new 10-year affordable homes programme. And the government has just released its response to the consultation it carried out in the autumn and winter on reforming the right to buy. So positive moves there, I would say. Additionally, as I said, the NPPF's been updated. The new standard method has come in, which is supposed to take us to this 1.5 million target in terms of making sure the housing need figures align with that. There's also reform proposed to the local plan system. We finally got the response from this government in February of this year to the July 2023 consultation on plan making reforms, but I can't see. People keep asking me when's that actually going to come in. I don't know is the answer, and Google doesn't tell me. So if anyone who's listening does have the answer to that, it'd be nice if they wanted to
put
share.
it in the Q&A, team. If you know,
Yeah.
we're all in this together. So if you've got information, stick it in the Q&A.
Yeah, and again on the sort of question around, is it about funding or about reform? I think equally in the planning and housing sphere, it's the same approach. So there was funding for additional planning officers in the October budget, and there's a reform proposed in the bill to planning fees. But equally, there's still kind of areas of reform that we're awaiting. So on this, the brownfield first approach, they said they were going to fast track approval of urban brownfield sites. Well, we haven't got brownfield passports with us yet, but we have had the grey belt policy that was introduced in the NPPF, which is having some effect. The percentage of successful green belt appeals has increased, but equally, and this is good news for me and probably not good news for anyone else listening, actually, unless there were lots of lawyers on the call, but PINS has said it's now defending a number of High Court challenges as to, what grey belt policy actually means. So inevitable, I think. We lawyers like to make a nuisance of ourselves, but yeah. And I think finally, just to touch on new towns, hopefully some good news on that relatively imminently. The task force said back in February that it had had over 100 expressions of interest from across every region in England, and it's supposed to be submitting its report to ministers over the summer. So it will be really interesting to see what that says. I'm actually looking forward to reading that. And on the infrastructure side, actually quite a lot of movement. So there's relevant provisions in the bill, the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, so for that, as you'd expect. But the government said it would develop a 10-year infrastructure strategy, and it's done that. It published it on the 19th of June. It also said it would set out new NPSs, and we're expecting revised energy NPSs fairly imminently, and then also the airport's NPS is next on the list, I think, depending on what Heathrow does. So, yeah, as I said, lots of movement across sort of everything. So big moves, smaller moves, consultations. I slightly feel as though there might be too many consultations for people to actually respond to. And I do question whether everyone has really got the bandwidth to kind of engage. And also it is then very difficult to work out exactly where things have got to. So it feels like there's a lot to keep on top of. Hopefully somebody at MHCLG has been tasked with that.
But it's not ideal when you're trying to create conditions of clarity, certainty and transparency, which is all of what we need, right, in terms of encouraging investment.
Yeah, I think I understand why they've just wanted to get out of the starting blocks really quickly, and I would say they've certainly done that. But whether it would have been better in, as you say, in creating good terms for investors to take a slightly slower but maybe more cohesive approach, we are where we are now. So
big interesting question from James in the Q&A, Heather. Just a big picture reflection on, when you think about all those different sort of interventions, his proposal is too much stick, not enough carrot, forcing rather than encouraging. What's your big picture takeaway on that? If you sort of sum up the various stuff, is there a lot of stick in there, not enough carrot, or vice versa, or what?
Yeah, I would agree that I think the purpose of that paper is to outline what the stick's intended to be. It does say that the delayed homes penalty is a measure of last resort, but I think conceptually I assume that the thinking was, well, We've tried to help out developers by reforming the NPPF and, you know, redoing the housing need position and so on and so forth. But actually, if they're going to then cause us problems, we need something to boot them along with as well.
Yeah.
I think it's right, though, to say that although there has been a lot of sort of positive assistance to the developer side of the industry through what's been happening with the planning reform, there are still these practical constraints. So if you've still got a nutrient neutrality problem or a water neutrality problem, or you can't, you know, you haven't got waste treatment capacity, or you can't connect to the electricity grid, or you can't even get your schemes constructed for reasons beyond your control, seems slightly unfair. You should then be hit with a
You then get
penalty.
penalised for doing stuff
Yeah.
that's not in, being stuff not in your control. I agree with that. Yeah. Okay, Paul, give us a sort of some of the highlights, some of the perspectives, again, in the sort of context of, you know, a desire, ambition, goal to be the fastest growing, but also, I guess, more particularly from our point of view, to have growth in, you know, have more growth in more parts of the country than we've historically seen.
Yeah, so the big challenge, I think, with the industrial strategy is that it doesn't really have a clear goal. And Andrew, we spoke about this on a previous event as well. And that's, I mean, any good strategy should have a very clear sort of stated goal at the top of it, because then everything else should fall in behind that goal. If that isn't stated, so well, how are you going to triage the recommendations that are coming underneath and the strategies that you put in underneath? I think that goal is really, really important. And the government has sort of floundered a little bit on this. You know, when it came in, you know, in that phase, when it was talking about growth being really important, the goal that they set then was to be the fastest growing economy in the G7. Well, what's that? Is that the fastest growing over 1 quarter? Is that the fastest growing over 1 year? You know, a lot of those things get revised and there's a lot of measurement error. And, you know, is it even the fastest growing over the period is the first question. The second thing is that it's not about being the fastest over 100 meters in this instance, it's about being fastest over the whole marathon. And the big challenge the UK has got is that France and Germany are 13% more productive than what the UK is. It's a big difference in living standards, and that's something that isn't closed in a quarter or in a year. It's going to take, you know, 5, 10, 15 years, if not longer, to narrow that gap. And so I think there need to be a tighter bounded goal about what it was they were trying to achieve. And that, I think that probably slightly fuzzy thinking comes through into the industrial strategy, where it talks about being the best place in the world to invest. Okay, I mean, I want world poverty to end as well, but you know, give me something a bit more tangible than that, which then allows everything else to fall in behind. So there is a challenge there. Having said that, when you then go into the detail of the industrial strategy, actually, I think there's quite a lot of sensible things there. And from our perspective, in particular around place, it's interesting that the government is prepared to take choices, because again, that's the other thing about strategy. The strategy that doesn't take choices isn't a strategy. In fairness, the strategy does take choices, and the government talks about that. It takes choices around sectors, and it takes choices around place. Now, from a place perspective, what it does, and this is how it brings on the industrial strategy from the 2018 version and the 2009 version under different governments, is that not only does it recognise that place is important, but it recognises that different places play different roles in the national economy. And crucially, I think what it recognises is that different places are further, some places are further from their potential than others. So if we were to pick out a place like, say, Hartlepool or Mansfield, for example, they're probably behind their potential. They don't perform very well. They're probably behind their potential, but their potential isn't very high because they're inherently quite small places. Whereas if we look at a place like Greater Manchester, for example, not only does it not perform very well, is also a fair distance away from its potential. You know, it lags well behind its European comparators, and that is the key challenge to growth. It is about trying to get Manchester to do better, Birmingham to do better, Glasgow to do better, as opposed to, you know, the rural economy, which, yes, is important, it's got a role to play, but really in terms of the national economy isn't of national significance. That's not the reason why the UK economy is lagging behind France and Germany, where their second tier cities play a much larger role in the national economy. So this bit's really good, it's really important. It does get buried a little bit in the industrial strategy, but it seems like that's something that is playing through in terms of thinking. And indeed, if we look at the spending review, you can see its influence in choices around spending as well, because there are a number of mayoral funds that are being set up that non-mayoral areas are not getting. So basically, the big cities are getting preference through policy to deal with this underperformance, to deal with what we think is one of the UK's largest economic challenges. So that's a really good thing. Of course, as I said in my first contribution, the issue now is not making the policy announcement, but it's actually about putting delivery in place.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. And that sets us up. So let's try and think about some of the sort of themes or the sort of cost-cutting issues that tell us a little bit about where we've got to, but also, I guess, when we look forward the next 12 months, the 24 months, 36 months, etc., things that you're on your mind as to how you think this is going to play out. And obviously we don't know. So, this is where we just sort of draw on our collective and previous experiences. Naomi, start us off with lots is happening in these three areas. Just give us your sort of reflections on questions around capacity, in a sense. How does that play out? How do you think progress will be enabled or hindered by a sort of capacity question to get this stuff done? And I guess we're primarily thinking about from a government, national, local perspective, not everything, because that's quite hard, but just how much of a bite do you think capacity has had? And similarly, Heather and Paul can say something on that.
Yeah. So the capacity issue, I mean, I think obviously we've seen a lot of kind of new policies and strategies kind of come in over the last 12 months. I think at national government, there's a lot of work going on to try and join the dots and figure out how all of these things fit together. I think you've seen some of that through like the industrial strategy, looking at the role of different departments in delivering different aspects of it. You've seen consideration of kind of employment support through the new NHS 10-year plan. So I think there are examples of where government are clearly really trying to join the dots, but there's more work to do because there is a lot of change being brought in. I think there's that also applies to some of the decisions that have been made in terms of increases to national insurance contributions that we saw being kind of they came through in April. Those sorts of decisions have an impact on the labour market. Yeah. And there is a question at the moment, in terms of the labour market trends that we're seeing. We've seen kind of 6 months of falling numbers of payroll employees, and starting to see potentially some of the effects on kind of retail and hospitality. And of course, that could be partly about the kind of increase to national insurance contributions, obviously increase to minimum wage too, but also kind of global uncertainty and business confidence. So there's a lot to untangle there, but these things can have a material impact on the labour market and employment, and kind of undermine what the government is trying to do.
Despite best intentions and all your endeavours, the kind of global forces might push in the opposite direction.
And decisions made elsewhere in government may work to undermine efforts to get more people into employment. But I think it's early days there, and a bit of a question mark. And of course, there are challenges with the labour market data at the moment, and trying to understand kind of what's going on. And that's a challenge at the national level, and obviously even more significant at the local
level.
So I think big challenge in terms of joining the dots across government. I think obviously, as I think it's long been recognised, there is quite a lot of variation at the local level across kind of MCAs and local partners in terms of kind of levels of resource and capacity to implement these reforms. I think there is progress being made, but I think obviously government, and I think DWP recognises the need to kind of enable, facilitate and support local partners as these plans are being kind of worked up and implemented, in terms of that focus on what works. We know a lot about what works. It's making sure that we're focusing
just doing it. Yeah, we're deploying the what works principles and ideas.
Exactly, going forward. So yeah, I think, you know, obvious challenges both at the national and the local level. And, you know, I mentioned a bit of a gap around the role of employers, and, you know, that thinking applies kind of equally at kind of national and local levels, but also on the skills side. We haven't seen, you know, we've seen over the longer term, last decade or so, quite significant falls in the adult skills budget. We haven't seen kind of any significant investment in adult skills. And of course, a lot of the challenges that we've been talking about in terms of the labour market, addressing some of the skills shortages that we've got, realising some of the ambitions in the industrial strategy, do require investment in skills.
So, that's very good. All right, great. Heather, similar question on the capacity, I suppose. And again, you know, when you look at if capacity is an issue, do you think it bites hardest at the, you know, in the national sort of sense, or, you know, the local sense, having to deal with all these reforms and actually in the end, you know, do the things that actually facilitate and enable and permit development? So just your reflections on capacity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a brake on delivery of housing and infrastructure, I think, but particularly housing. And the problem is at the local level. I mean, it's been obvious to me, even in the sort of decade and a half that I've been doing this, that local planning authorities are just, you know, under-resourced and then more under-resourced. And, you know, the government has committed the funding to try and ameliorate that. But that will take time, I think. And it's also things like, it's not just about planning officers. You need local authority lawyers or some form of contracting out to external legal services to get Section 106 obligations through the system. I mean, they are holding things up really badly, and it takes usually months, to be honest, to get what often should be quite a simple contract, you know, signed and sealed. So I think there is a problem in terms of capacity. It's more at the local level. I think PINs at the national level seem to have a sort of quite proactive plan. They know what's coming down the line, or at least they've got a kind of outline awareness of the fact that there is, you know, local plan changes. There are the moves on the infrastructure side, and the government wanting to get 150 NSIPs away during Parliament. So I think PINs is bracing itself for an increased workload. But the kind of hold up from a capacity perspective seems to me to be worst at the local level. Although it's, again, it is kind of sort of very geographically specific. There are some of the London boroughs, for example, seem to fare quite well, but they're a bit of a special case, really. I think it depends, you know, on your population size, what you're dealing with, because some of the difficulties in planning don't affect, you know, that many. If you're not a green belt authority or you don't have a nutrient neutrality problem, then you've got less to think about than other places might have.
Yeah, very good. It's good. Yeah, that's a good point around that. I'd be interesting question about, you know, the extent to which expertise and/or extra capacity can be deployed through organisations like Homes England or, you know, others in that sort of space. So, you know, some that are in the employment space as well, to supplement and complement while you're trying to build up the resource at the local level as well. Paul, similar question, but just your reflections on, you know, capacity as being a constraint, or, you know, not just a constraint, also an opportunity, I suppose, in some places. But thoughts on that?
Well, on the strategy production side, it doesn't feel like there's been a huge constraint within the central government to produce those strategies. You could argue that maybe they could have been produced more quickly. So in that respect, perhaps, but it doesn't seem that that's been the enormous barriers to why it's taken a year to produce them. I think it's part of this is just thinking through what they want to do and consulting with relevant stakeholders, etc. does take time. I think the issue probably now, or where capacity might start to bite, is from this moment on about actually trying to deliver some of these things. Now, and the good thing is that, as I said earlier, the government has taken choices. So hopefully that then means it's a bit more focused in its approach. So hopefully capacity won't be such a challenge. But I think there are probably two things to reflect on within this. I think first is capacity at the national level, but also at the local level as well, reflecting what Heather said. I think the mayoralties and the combined authority teams are probably expected to be delivering some of these things. And is the capacity there or is it not? I don't know, but we will find out. I think the second thing is that probably the government's approach to devolution, which in principle was meant to be part of the growth agenda, although I think that has strayed probably in recent months. I think that as an adjacent policy, but has hit this issue around bandwidth, because there wasn't a great deal of, there weren't so many choices taken in the devolution approach. Like everywhere's going to get a devolution deal and we're relaxed about getting them, blah, blah, blah. We've got a jam spread to some extent rather than focusing in on giving big cities even more powers. And it seems as if actually then, because there hasn't been that targeted approach, that actually bandwidth and capacity has started to become an issue in terms of trying to do all these deals across the country. And it feels as if the devolution agenda has become a little bit unstuck because of that. So what will then happen to the growth agenda? Well, if it stays targeted, hopefully the capacity won't be such a big a deal. But the only way we'll find out is how actually we play this experiment out in the coming months and years.
Yeah, no, very good. And we touched on, the sort of balance between money and reform, and what's expected and such. And we've got about 10 minutes left. But Heather, interestingly, and we had a question on this, but it's just more general. If we're 12 months in, government came in with a sort of 10-year renewal plan, lots of reform, lots of change, lots of new things being done, as you've all illustrated and exampled in those policy areas and many other policy areas that we're not really talking about. In terms of a sort of timing question or a returns to activity question, Heather, I mean, you talked about the numbers being pretty bad or not very good now. In an ideal world, assuming these reforms play out in the way that we think they might or hope they might, when does the implementation, when does the change on the ground begin to happen? Is it 2 years hence? Is it 3 years hence? How do you think about that? And that, because that's a real issue, right? I mean, in the sense that if everything is long term, then that in itself is laudable, but also creates a bit of a challenge for pushing through some of these policies. So just your best guess on some of those sorts of things, Heather?
Yeah, I think it's a range. So new towns, for example, I mean, I know the task force itself is sort of deliberating on whether they should be kind of making any contribution to this 1.5 million, because realistically, I'd be surprised if we see any new towns with people actually living in them, and certainly not in the short or even the medium term. That's a longer term goal, I think.
Yeah.
But things like, the suggestion that there's a sort of artificial suppression of demand because first-time buyers don't have the support they need anymore. Well, the government is supposed to be looking at that and doing something about it this month, I think, launching a mortgage guarantee scheme. So if things like that in terms of financial support and financial levers can be altered really quite quickly, I would expect to see an improvement. If that is suppressing demand, I would expect to see that go. And also the practical constraints like water neutrality, nutrient neutrality, I would hope to see a solution to those in the next year or two rather than, the next parliament. So I think there are a lot of developments that I'm anticipating to see kind of bear fruit in the next year or two, and certainly in the life of parliament. But then there are also things that, won't happen until the next one.
And are you already detecting sort of changing behaviours, changing decisions by developers, house builders, investors, based on some of the the signals that the government has put out, even if they're not yet legal or enforceable or actual policy? Grey Belt is a good example, right, where it seems to have had almost an immediate effect just from a signalling perspective. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. Grey Belt has had a positive effect. I don't think it'll get us to 1.5 million, but it has been positive. And the new standard method as well, and what that has meant in terms of the consequences for the housing need figures in some authorities in particular, means that I think the developer side of the system is in a more positive place and certainly more enthusiastic. And also just having the new NPPF and not being in a position where we were just waiting for it to emerge for, I think, a year, has given the market more sort of energy.
Great. Naomi, I guess it's sort of timing question to you, but also, the government's been busy. Similar question as to Heather at the end. The government's been busy saying they're going to do things as well as doing things. Are you seeing behavioural change? Different decisions in the market. Employers acting slightly differently as a result of that already, even if the policy is not formalised, etc., or the bill has not been been brought into force.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a lot of things going on that are impacting on kind of employer behaviour, and a lot of things that employers will be trying to get to grips with, not least the Employment Rights Bill. And obviously, government have just set out the roadmap for the implementation and consultation of that. I think we're possibly seeing some of the impacts of kind of government policy on employer decision making around kind of hiring, for instance, already kind of playing out. But so I think there is a lot for employers to get to grips with, and I think that many employers are still trying to understand the implications of what's coming down the road. But yeah, I think in terms of the kind of timeline, I think from what I've seen, at the local level, obviously we've talked about the ambition around the 80% employment rate, and that being a long-term ambition. But we are seeing a focus at the kind of local level, at the MCA level, of okay, so these are big ambitions. We're looking at quite significant reform at across kind of services, and they're very much focused on what are the priority actions here. What do we need to do first, and how do we sequence those? So I think that thinking is there, and it's being worked through. But as I said kind of earlier, I think these things will take time, and I think there is a danger that we try to rush through some of this stuff, and then it becomes tokenistic, and we don't see the type of change that we need. So a slight worry that we don't want to see what we've seen in the past in terms of short-termism and kind of short-term funding, and kind of on to the next. We've tried that, on to the next strategy. I think, I think the current one is the right approach, and it's just making sure that we've got enough time to work.
Yeah, and it goes to your point you made earlier on about what bedevils us in many policy fields is the churn, the constant, start again, pull it up, and then actually progress is always in the long term, because we're never given any initiative or any idea long enough to bear fruit. Come in on this, Paul, around the sort of timing, question, and then I've got a quick fire just on what we hope to see. What do we think is going to important milestones in the next 12 months, just from each of you to finish off? But just on this timing question, Paul.
In terms of them actually delivering things, do you mean, Andrew?
Yeah.
So, I mean, like I said earlier, 4 years out from the next general election feels like a long time. But if you're going to start seeing results on the growth perspective, you're going to have to be making those investments now. So I think really you want to be seeing some tangible announcements over the next 6 months about this investment, £113 billion of infrastructure investment, £86 billion of R&D investment. What exactly is it going to be invested on? And do we want to see spades in the ground or work in labs or whatever it might be as a result of that? That's going to be the key thing. I think the other interesting thing about this, and Matthew put this in as one of the questions, is about being able to show sort of these retail short-term wins relative to the long-term things that the government's trying to do. And I think across all of the things that we've talked about today, ultimately we're talking about trying to fix systems or fix performance, which are long-term challenges. And there is a question about whether we even will see, would any government see results within a 5-year parliamentary stint? Maybe not. But that is then a big challenge for this government, or indeed any other government, because how is it going to demonstrate that it's made progress? And I certainly think it needs to probably think a little bit more about that, not least because of the sort of the political shenanigans that have been going on in Westminster in the last couple of months.
Yeah.
There is something I think interesting within this as well, though, that when you look at opinion ratings, Keir Starmer isn't doing particularly well, Labour aren't doing particularly well. And yet, if you listen to the things that all three of us have said today, there are actually some really interesting policies that are going on. Now, to some degree, that's politics, but also I think there is an interesting thing about how the media probably covers some of these things, and that we have a bit of an obsession about the Punch and Judy element of politics. And it doesn't really feel like we have much of a scrutiny on actual policy. And I think there needs to be much more of a policy discussion in the national media about what it is that this government or another government is or has done, as opposed to just personality X says something which is different to personality Y. Oh, isn't that interesting?
Yeah, that is a very good point. Something that, as you know, I completely and utterly agree with. So, maybe that's a subject for another session. Heather, final thought, brief thought on, if you're thinking about the next 12 months in the sort of planning space, are there notable milestones that are, that point in the direction of moving some of the things that we've been talking on, or is it now all out there and now it's all about implementation? Or are there still, you talked a little bit about new towns, as it were, coming sort of the other side of summer, but are there other big notable milestones that, that you'll be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, so there's the new towns and the task force report. There's the planning and infrastructure bill, hopefully will finish making its way through Parliament and come onto the statute book. There's local plan reform. I think that's supposed to be happening later this year, maybe. So there are, I'd like to see, I think something concrete, to be honest, off the back of the various consultations that the government's kind of either currently analysing or it's published its response, but then nothing yet has happened following on from that. I also think on the infrastructure side, I feel like that's sort of really in motion and that could just continue. And that would, it probably needs more funding, but that's not really a planning reform point. But on the housing and the delivery of these 1.5 million homes, I think it's entirely fair at the moment for Labour, if they wanted to say, well, hang on, it's only been a year, okay, the figures so far aren't great, but we're just kind of getting things moving and you've just got to wait. I think if this time next year they're still way off track, they need to stop and take a, look again at what the kind of break on delivery of these units is, if it's because they're not going to be able to then point to the fact that the planning system still isn't lined up to deliver them. And I would expect, now that we've got the new standard method and the revisions of the NPPF, I would expect in the next 12 months to see an uptick in actual delivery of those units. And if that doesn't happen, I think, I don't like short-termism or sort of reactionary kind of political maneuvers either, but you can't just wait until you're in year 3 and then find yourself way off program.
Yeah, that is a very good point. Naomi, what are the big milestones in your space that you'll be keeping an eye on next 12 months?
Well, there's lots going on. Obviously we're awaiting the post-16 skills strategy and questions on kind of what next in terms of the growth and skills levy. I've mentioned already kind of pressing need around investment in adult skills, and I think we'll wait to see kind of what's happening in that space, and that extends to thinking about the kind of future of apprenticeships and how we maintain quality in apprenticeships. Questions there. Obviously we're expecting the Mayfield review to report in autumn. Really important in terms of thinking about the employer role in all of this, and kind of retention of people in work. And then obviously kind of looking at what's going on in terms of the implementation of the government's Get Britain Working reforms. As I've mentioned, it's very early days in terms of the Job Centre Plus reform, but obviously we'll be looking at how that's implemented and how well kind of job centres are being integrated within those local plans.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Paul, just a final thought on you or on important milestones in the next 12 months.
It is to show that the industrial strategy is more than digital words in a PDF. show some delivery from it.
And we'll get a devolution act or bill that will be soonish, we've been told. Is that right?
That is true, yes, that too. That'd be great.
Yeah, brilliant. It's interesting, all three of you are kind of mix of the next 12 months. There'll be more reviews, more consultation, more ideas about what's to be done, as well as trying to enact all the stuff that has already been announced, which has been a blizzard just in the three areas that we've touched on, plus many other policy areas, which I know are as equally as busy. So it's an interesting challenge. And I think maybe in 12 months' time, as Heather said, we'll come back and we can see actually, are we seeing the fruits of some of the proposals and some of the suggestions, some of the reforms beginning to become reality, which will be an interesting question, because then, as you say, the obvious thing will be 2 years in. Thank you all for being on the call. I hope that's been helpful and different. Obviously said there was lots of reviews about the politics. We wanted to do something on the policy, of which there is much and a lot going on, and probably lots more than actually many realise. That's a challenge for the government, I feel. But for now, thank you to my panel, Heather, Naomi and Paul. Thank you all for listening, and until the next time, take care and stay safe. Bye for now.